but to strive for better understanding with adab and civility in a manner befitting the greatness of the legacy we aspire to represent and uphold. I would like to begin by thanking our primary donor for tonight's event. He doesn't want his name to be mentioned, but he's asked us instead to pray for his grandmother, Ahmadun Nisa, also known as Bibi Jan, who died in childbirth, bringing his father into the world. May Allah forgive her and accept all of our prayers for her forgiveness. In a wonderful hadith or saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are informed that when a person dies, his deeds come to an end, except for three things: sadaqah jariyah, or charity that endures; knowledge which is beneficial; or a virtuous descendant who prays for the deceased. So we pray, Allahumma gfir laha warhamha, Allahumma gfir li shahidina wa ghaibina, wa saghirina wa kabirina, wa dhakarina wa unthana. Allahumma man ahyaytahu minna fa ahyihi ala al-Islam, wa man tawaffaytahu minna fa tawaffahu ala al-Iman. Allahumma ameen. I'd also like to thank Dr. Munir Jiwa, the Center for Islamic Studies, for partnering with us for tonight's program and for supporting the many activities of Zaytuna College on the Hill in so many ways. Before we begin, let me also announce that we have an incredible lineup of events and programs on the horizon. Next week, on January 28th, there is a vocal a cappella performance by Wazania Ensemble. Their music is intended to lift the soul and to encourage a connection with the beauty of the Quran. Also, we have Brother Hassan Al-Ja'i in the audience with us. He'll be performing a dramatic reading of the 40 Rules of Love, which is on the journey of Shams of Tabriz to Konya in the 13th century. That'll be in the first week of February. And the next main event for the Center for Islamic Studies is in collaboration with Dr. Hatim Bazian and the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley, entitled Institutionalizing Islamophobia, Critiquing the Countering Violent Extremism, CVE Framework and Emerging Programs, which will be on February 5th and 6th in Boalt Law School. On February 27th, Zaytuna has its annual benefit dinner in the Bay Area. Please come out to support us so we can bring more such programs to you and also educate and prepare the next generation. And on March 4th to 5th, we have a major conference right here in this hall on revisiting the relationship between reason and revelation in the thought of Imam al-Ghazali. So stay tuned for coming up, and we hope to see many of you here with us. Turning now to tonight's event. The Study Quran is perhaps the most significant publication on Islam in the English language in modern history. It's my opinion. You don't have to agree with its contents, but it's a significant publication. A collaborative effort among Muslim academics that took a decade of scholarly labor to complete. Under the leadership of Professor Sayyid Hussain Nasr, the Study Quran gives the English reader access to the great works of tafsir in the classical scholarly tradition, mediated, and this is key, mediated by the intense scholarly research, analysis, and creative synthesis of 5 Muslim academics who have drawn from 40 major sources from the classical exegetical tradition. Sources that are juristic, mystical, theological, philosophical, and linguistic, from the whole breadth, from both the Sunni and Shi'i traditions, both Sunni and Shi'i perspectives. As such, the work carries its own voice as a synthesis. It should be considered not as one that simply transmits the tradition of the past, but as a work that processes and recasts it. Among the questions that such a study raises are the following, and these are some of the prompts we've asked our distinguished guest, whom I will introduce in a moment, to address. Can Muslims view it, the Study Quran, as a devotional text if it doesn't fully represent any single tradition within Islam? Which school of thought, if any, does the Study Quran represent? If none or all, what does that even mean? Number 2, should readers who are not Muslim view the book as an objective source on Islam even if it eschews Western academic approaches to the study of the Quran. To quote from the general introduction, I quote, "Inasmuch as the Quran is the central sacred revealed reality for Muslims, the study Quran addresses it as such and does not limit it to a work of merely historical, social, or linguistic interest divorced from its sacred and revealed character." End quote. Now this approach stands in stark contrast to what is acceptable in the academic study of religion. How should the work be received and taught in American colleges and university classrooms? So in sum, that's two questions so far. Number one, how should Muslims receive the study Quran? And number two, how should the academy receive the study Quran? Add to these two a third. As a work produced by Muslim academics with qualifications from and professional careers in Western colleges and universities, does the study Quran shift authority away from the tradition and traditional scholars in a manner that challenges the consensus reached by them in centuries past? So those are three broad framing questions that we'd like our speaker to address initially before we go into conversation with the panelists and inshallah with the audience. So tonight we look forward to a riveting conversation around these questions and more with one of the general editors and authors of significant portions of the study Quran, Dr. Jospeh Lumbard. We also have with us two faculty members on stage, Ustad Ali Atai and Abdullah Ali, whom I will introduce when we get to the discussion portion a little later. I would be remiss not to mention that we have also invited Zaytuna faculty member Dr. Rania Awad to be with us. We had invited her on the panel, but she was unable to be here because of another commitment. And this is a special note to the hashtag all-male panel movement that has been calling out Muslim institutions for their lack of gender diversity. Point noted. But please note from our side the tremendously rich and diversity of Zaytuna College faculty and staff that consists of women and men on the faculty and on the executive leadership and throughout the staff. Scholars educated in both traditional Muslim and Western academic institutions, Muslims and members of other faiths. We are blessed with one of the finest and most diverse faculties of any undergraduate liberal arts college offering a major in Islamic theology, law and theology in the country. Thanks to your continued support and prayers by the grace of God. Alhamdulillah. Turning now to our guest for the evening. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jospeh Lumbard. Dr. Lumbard is a professor at the Department of Arabic and Translation Studies at the American University of Sharjah. He is also an associate editor for the Integrated Encyclopedia of the Quran, which is in progress, a specialist in Quranic studies, Sufism, Islamic philosophy, comparative theology, and Islamic eco-theology. He is the editor of Islam, Fundamentalism, and the Betrayal of Tradition, and author of Submission, Faith, and Beauty, The Religion of Islam. And this work he published through Zaytuna in 2009. He's also author of Ahmad al-Ghazali, Remembrance and the Metaphysics of Love, forthcoming from SUNY Press this year. Prior to moving to Sharjah, Dr. Lumbard served on the faculties of the American University of Cairo and Brandeis University. He also spent time at the Al-Bayt Institute in Jordan, contributing significantly to what is known as the Amman Message. He holds a PhD from Yale University, where I studied as well, as did Sheikh Yasser Qadi, under the tutelage of the Jesuit professor Gerhard Bovering. I distinctly remember my first encounter with Joseph when I was a newly minted graduate student sitting in Professor Bovering's office. A tall man alighted from the elevator with his bags, and Professor Bovering, I've never seen him like this, squealed with joy. Oh, and he got up and he rushed to embrace Joseph. And my impression was, who could this man be? And we've grown to be nice colleagues. He's been a mentor and a close friend. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jospeh Lumbard.
Assalamu alaikum. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وعلى أصحابه وعلى إخوانه ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي بسم الله. Thank you very much, Mahan, for the introduction, and thank you also to Zaytuna for this opportunity, and to the Islamic Center of the Center for Islamic Studies. There's a lot going on here on Holy Hill. I haven't gotten all the names down yet. For the Center of Islamic Studies, and thank you all very much for coming out this evening and taking the time out of your evening to attend this event. Now, I want to begin by, I'm going to address these 3 points that Dr. Mirza outlined. But I want to begin by talking about the genesis of the study Quran and how it came into being. One of the reasons I want to do this is because some people imagine that this work came about in the same way that many academic works do, which is that you have the idea and you work on your project, and then you propose it to a publisher, shop it around to different publishers until you finally find one that is actually willing to put up with you. Now, this was actually very different. What happened is that the phenomenon of the study Bible is a well-established genre. There's the HarperCollins Study Bible, there's the Jewish Study Bible, the Catholic Study Bible, the Orthodox Study Bible, the Oxford Annotated Bible, the ESV, the NIV, the list goes on. This is a well-established genre that sold many hundreds of thousands of copies, and if you walk into the office of any religious studies professor, they're going to have at least one of them on their desk or on their shelf, at whatever field they are in. So HarperCollins, who actually began the genre of the study Bible, they published the first one back, I think it was, in the late 40s or 50s, or early 50s. They had the idea, well, why don't we come up with a study Quran? And they proposed the idea to Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Now, as Sayyid Hussein Nasr tells the story, he says, when they first proposed this idea, I didn't want to do this. He said, I'm a scholar of philosophy, I'm a scholar of Sufism, a scholar of Islamic science. Really, for him, the Quran has always been a part of his devotional life. And of course, he was versed in all of the academic study of it. But I remember one time when I was a student of his, a graduate student asked him, why don't you teach a course on the Quran? And he said, because it's too much. The Word of God is too much. So it really is something that he had such reverence for the Quran that in a sense he always avoided it as part of his scholarship, but kept it as part of his devotional life. And I myself, in many ways, had followed his lead in that in my own academic career, where I had studied, as Dr. Mirza said, under Gerhard Bovering, and this is one of his specialties, is Quranic studies, but I went more into Sufi studies. But I was versed with all the arguments, and of course the Quran was part of my devotional life as well. But when Dr. Nasr sat down and thought about it, after he had initially thought that he didn't want to do this, he said to himself, and he's told this story many times, you can find it on YouTube and all kinds of places, he said to himself, well, I'm going to have to answer for this before God on the Day of Judgment. I put down God's word. Somebody came to me and asked me to help explain God's word to others, and I turned away and I put it down. I'm going to have to answer for that. Now, he hasn't said this in these discussions, but I remember one time he was also talking to me, and he said to me, also, you can't control. If they've proposed it to you and you say no, you don't get to decide who it goes to after that. If any of you know the field of Quranic studies, there are some people out there, there are some perspectives out there that if it was turned over to them, Muslims would be in just, I mean, this would, in a sense, put the presentation of the Quran, from our perspective, would put it back 25 years or more within the Western context. And so this really, one could say that in a sense, He viewed it as a fard kifaya, as a sufficient responsibility that somebody had to take on, and it had been put in his lap. I was a bit more arrogant, and I was really excited. Astaghfirullah. So this is really how the project came about. And it's important to keep that in mind, because this is really the spirit that guided this project throughout. And it's something that really guided it until the last days when we finally submitted this to the publisher. And we really put aside so many other things in our lives. And my wife and Dr. Janer Dale's wife used to joke with each other that they had assumed the status of second wife next to the study Quran. And it really was all-consuming in many ways. Now, that being said, I want to get to some of these issues that Dr. Mirza raised. Really, one could break this down, his first two questions, into how should Muslims approach this, and how should non-Muslims approach this? In the first question, he mentioned the issue. The way he phrased it is, can Muslims view it as a devotional text if it doesn't fully represent any single tradition within Islam? I don't view it as a devotional text. Now, it's a text that, what I view as a devotional text, I view the Quran itself as a devotional text. I don't view the tafsir of al-Qurtubi as a devotional text. I view the awrad that people say that are taken mostly from the Quran as a devotional text. I view many of the litanies that we sing in praise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as devotional texts. But I do not view tafsir as devotional texts. And in this context, I don't really think that one could necessarily say that this is a devotional text. However, just as one can go into a tafsir and read about the verses of Quran that one cites as part of one's regular devotions, and gain something from that and gain insight into those devotional texts. I think that one can do this with the study Quran as well. There are many Muslims out there who will read, for example, Surah Yasin every morning, Surah Al-Waqi'ah every evening, but really don't have access to Quran commentaries because they really only know enough Arabic to be able to recite the Quran regularly. Alhamdulillah, that is a beautiful thing. But this is a text that can, in that way, in a sense, help one to do this. And one doesn't have to. Should they view it as a devotional text? I don't say anybody should necessarily do one thing or the other with the study Quran. As my grandfather would always say to me, he'd say, you can give a person any book that you want, but it doesn't mean they have to read it. It's the same thing with any book you write. You know, academics are used to that. We write books that nobody reads. But in this case, it's a little different. People are actually reading it, alhamdulillah. But so I don't think it's that, and I think that it can be useful for people in that respect if they so choose. Now, the next question is a little bit more intricate. Should readers who are not Muslim view the book as an objective source about Islam, even if it eschews Western academic approaches to the study of the Quran? The question is wrong, because it does not eschew Western academic approaches to the study of the text. It does not eschew them, but it is not grounded in them. And this is a very important distinction. Now, one of the things that we have attempted to do with the study Quran is to resituate the approach to the Quran within the Western academia in the classical commentary tradition itself. If one goes through the history of Western academic approaches to the Quran, they often operate completely independently of the Islamic academic tradition. From my humble perspective, this is academically irresponsible. You can't just simply sit there and say, well, we're going to do an independent academic tradition over here and wipe out 1,200 years, 1,400 years of scholarship on the text that you want to approach. This is something that one sees if one goes into the encyclopedia of the Quran. The encyclopedia of the Quran has articles in it that cite only Western literature on the Quran. This is racism. That's all it is. It's racism, pure and simple. All right? It's saying that the categories of thought that are determined within the Euro-American intellectual system, and really out of only 5 countries within that system, that those categories of thought are the only valid categories of thought through which one can understand the text of any tradition. And we say no. That actually there are thousands of books that are written that from within the Islamic tradition that help one to approach the text. Now, this is actually a very important question when one comes to the question of the history of the text. The classical tafsir tradition is concerned with the history of the Quran at times to the point of obsession. And this is actually something that very much separates the tafsir tradition from the tradition of biblical commentary. In the tradition of biblical commentary, you don't have anything akin to the asbab an-nuzul, the occasions of revelation, which actually, I think it's more effective for us to call them the historical contexts. So we actually have a historical critical methodology within our tradition. And the historical critical methodology is the primary concern of the Western academic tradition. Now, here's the problem. Because the Western academic tradition has decided to eschew the classical Islamic tradition, people come up with all kinds of different approaches to the text. These approaches are sometimes called theories, but they don't actually even rise to the level of a theory. Because a theory is something that you take the data that you have before you, and you take the historical, factual data, and you can then test it against the theory. And if the factual data shows that the hypothesis or theory is incorrect, you come up with a new theory. Well, this has not been happening in many places within the Western academic tradition. So these are really coherent sets of assumptions that rest within the paradigms of the Euro-American intellectual system. And because of that, people tend not to challenge them, and they think, okay, well, because these other things come from different paradigms, then they don't classify. But what has ended up happening is because you have so many of these different approaches, from it's grounded in Hebrew sources, it's grounded in Syriac sources, it comes from this origin, it comes from that origin, and all of these different things, that they end up being mutually contradictory. And if one were to ground a study Quran in the Western academic tradition of the study of the Quran right now, it would be so methodologically diffuse as to render it incoherent, because the field is completely inchoate. What we hope the study Quran will achieve is to lend some form and shape to that academic tradition. Now, you can't just, Behnam Siddiqui has, I think, put it best in one simple sentence. He says that when it comes to the history of the Quranic text, the Western academic tradition succeeded in making a mountain into a molehill. There's so much historical data out there, so much that has been written about just the collection of the text, and about how these verses came to be, and the circumstances in which they came to be, and how they're related to one another, that has just been completely ignored. Now, if we're going to be honest as academics, even if we don't agree with it, we have to engage it. And so this is one of the things that we hope this text will achieve. So yes, to answer the question, I do think that people can take it as being an objective source about Islam, an objective source about the Quran. And as many people have pointed out, we have multiple different perspectives in there, and I think that we have been relatively objective. I mean, one is always making a choice, and one always has perspective. And so one cannot have, God is the only one with complete objectivity. And may we all, inshallah, attain it someday. But so no, it's not going to be completely objective. But yes, I do think that it can be an objective source. Now, the third question. As a work produced by Muslim academics for specialists and students, as well as for Muslims and the broader public, does it shift authority away from traditional scholars when it comes to understanding the Quran and Islam in the modern world? Welcome to the 21st century. That has been happening. All right, there's been a lot of this already going on in particular spheres where people who exist more within, and it's been happening quite a bit for more than 100 years actually, where people who are more within the university environment and both in the West and in the Islamic world have had some of the authority of interpreting the tradition placed upon them. Case in point, Sayyid Hussein Nasr. I mean, Sayyid Hussein Nasr writes from within the university context, and his perspectives regarding Islam have shaped the way in which it is engaged within faith communities themselves in many parts of the Islamic world in different ways, in subtle ways. A very important point here that we should all remember, well, all contemplate, I think, is that we're at a very interesting time in Islamic history. The Islamic intellectual tradition has had historically two international languages of intellectual discourse, Arabic and Persian. Turkish was never a language of intellectual discourse. It was spread internationally, but mostly as a language of a kind of administrative discourse. But because the lands that the Ottoman Empire occupied were Arab speaking, there was no need to kind of switch over to Turkish as the language for scholarship. But now, all of a sudden, English is emerging as a third international language of Islamic intellectual discourse. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why this institution is so fundamentally important. All right. What Zaytuna has the possibility to do is to really be at the forefront of shaping that discourse. And it's a fundamentally important thing that I think all of us should realize where we are in that process. The process is too far along for us to stop it. So it's a process that we have to figure out ways to shape. And I believe that the study Quran can be one of the important texts in the shaping of that discourse. Now, there is no effort to shift anything away from, shall we say, traditional scholars, but there is an effort to shift the focus and the weight back to the tradition. Which is to say that this, again, comes into the fact that so many people have tried, both within the Islamic community, there are certain strands out there that just want to say, skip all this stuff over. What we need to do is throw out Tabari, throw out Ibn Kathir, throw out some, no, I didn't read them, but throw them away anyways. All right? You know, it's like, what are you talking about? You don't even know what they said. And you go into some of these guys, it's like people want to go into a verse like 434, the famous, فَادْرِبُوهُنَّ, the verse that is always spoken about, the most talked about verse in the 21st century, which has the remark on beating a woman at the end of it. And you go into the classic tradition, and they tried to deal with it in multiple different ways. Now, we can engage that and use some of those ways to engage with the problems and to address the problems that we have today. We should not imagine that people didn't have some of these same issues. You go in and you read some of the commentaries, they were just as uncomfortable with some of the implications of that verse as we are today. And they give us some tools for how to deal with it. And there are many other instances in the Quran where people are trying to talk about an issue, and you find, well, wait a minute, everybody else was talking about this same issue 500 years ago. But more importantly, even if one is coming up with a new solution, it still should be in dialogue with the tradition. Now that, by the way, from my perspective, that's what tradition is. Tradition is this living, continuing dialogue. Tradition is alive. Tradition is fluid. Tradition is often in tension. But when it's in tension is when it is most active. When it's stayed and it's just sitting there, then you've moved in traditionalism. Traditionalism is dead. Traditionalism is about making idols of the past. All right, but we are alive here today, and we can be in dialogue with these scholars. When we go through certain issues, you're going to find that Ibn Taymiyyah disagreed with Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, they disagreed with Ibn al-Arabi, Tajuddin Subki criticized Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Jawzi for their position. And later on, Rashid Rida came down the line and came up with another perspective from all of them, but they were in dialogue with each other. They weren't just doing this out of the vacuum. Now, one of the things is that, from my perspective, when you look at this, what holds tradition together is not always coming to the same conclusions, but it is also often there are methodological tools that are consistent, and sometimes under different historical circumstances, those same methodological tools are going to bring us somewhat different conclusions. And at the same time, there's ikhlas, sincerity. We tend to forget that when people have disagreements about things, sometimes it's because one's right and one's wrong. Usually it's because they're both wrong. Sometimes it's because they're both right, but they're looking at it from different perspectives. This is actually how, if you think about it, that's how we actually explain to ourselves many of the conflicts between the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in the first century of Islam, is that they were all sincere and they had different perspectives. Now, this is the situation where you have in the classical tradition, all right? But people are coming at it from different ways. And so within the study Quran, you have lots of different perspectives that are put up side by side. There are some verses for which we've given you 6, 7 different ways in which the tradition has approached a particular verse. Other verses where we don't actually say much. But this really is how the classical tradition worked, and it's something that we should experience and appreciate in its full depth and breadth in order for us to live within it in the present and actually be able to use the tools of the tradition to answer the exigencies of the present, rather than, as I said this before, rather than making idols out of the figures of the past. So in this way, I think that while some people might think that people doing this from within a university context might be shifting the authority away from traditional scholars in one place or another, I actually think that the main thing that we're really doing is hopefully showing people the tradition, and in that way shifting the authority. Well, I don't want to say shifting it, but reminding people that that is actually where the authority lies. All right. Now, we're going to open it up to other questions. Did you want me to stand here or to sit down for the next part?
Stay there for a moment.
All right.
I really would like the panel to come in, but there were a few questions that came in, actually, a lot of questions that came in online. And can you hear me? Okay. And it's impossible to engage all of them point by point. But what I've tried to do is summarize and group them together so we can talk about a broader analytical framework that can help guide the future discussion rather than get us bogged down in too many specifics for which we don't have the time or the format here. So I have 4 points. The first is not a question. It's pretty much an allegation. The study Quran is perennialist and will misguide people away from orthodoxy. It digresses from the Sunni creed, and the use of Shi'i sources is indicative of such digression. So you can feel free to respond. That's my paraphrase of what I'm reading from outside.
Yeah, those were like 52 questions put into one, right? Yeah. Yeah, so,
Okay.
all right. There's a lot going on in that question. I mean, for example, look, when you want to throw around the word orthodoxy, you always have to remember that one man's orthodoxy is another man's heterodoxy and vice versa. And the orthodoxy is a very, very problematic term. And it tends to be something that is at times hurled about somewhat irresponsibly. And yeah, there are positions in the study Quran where you've got a Shia, but look, there's stuff in there I don't agree with. All right, there are perspectives in there that I say, well, this is what people said about this verse. This is really a very widespread interpretation and understanding of this verse. I don't agree, but here it is. All right, you don't have to agree with it. This is not a doctrinal text. This is not something that anybody should be picking up as if this is going to give them their creed for their particular tradition. Now, I think that if Sunnis are upset that it has too many things that don't fit with the Sunni creed, and Shiites are upset that it doesn't represent the Shiite creed well enough, and Sufis are upset that it's not esoteric enough in certain places, and Western scholars are upset that it doesn't actually give enough credence to certain aspects of the Western approach to the text, then we've succeeded. I mean, seriously, there's a famous Arabic proverb that says, whosoever does not have a critic is a dumbass. And it's true.
Well,
if you're going to go out there and be an intellectual, what's that?
I said on that note, I think we can call it a night. Unless you'd like to add something.
So, really, this is actually, we knew this coming out. We knew that basically, that ultimately no one was going to be happy with it. Now, one of the problems that's come out with some of the things that you've said is that people, they go in and they focus on one thing. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Okay, so that's one interpretation of that verse. There happen to be 5 more that are there. You didn't read them all first and take a look. And if you didn't like that particular one, then, big deal. There's stuff in Tabari. Look, if you really go sit down and read the tafsir tradition for a while, there's stuff in there that'll make your hair stand on end. And it's not all in the study Quran, I guarantee you. There's some stuff in there where you would sit down there and your jaw, you would say, Fakhruddin Razi wrote that! And just sit there. So there are a lot of things that are in there. It is a broad, diverse, multi-textured tradition. And we haven't done it, the full justice that it deserves. If we had done a 30-volume work on the Quran, we would not have done it full justice. But really, there is no effort to do that. So the idea, you use the word digresses from the Sunni creed. To say that it digresses would be to assume that it actually tried to be in it in the first place. All right? When there are certain verses that pertain to certain fundamental issues of Sunni creed, we have tried to bring that out. But we have not said that that's the only perspective on those verses. All right?
Okay.
So, now, you used the word.
Which
all
one?
right? The word. Perennialism. Yeah. Now, I'm glad you used this word. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was hoping you would tell me.
Yeah, well, you see, that's it. But that's exactly the problem, is that people have started to cast the word perennialism around in an incredibly irresponsible way. I mean, most people don't even know what it actually means. The baseline, and there are lots of different schools of perennialism. Now, the baseline of perennialism is that there is one truth which is manifest in the world's religious traditions in multiple different ways. As best I know, according to the Quran, all the prophets came with one message. La ilaha illallah. All right? I mean, that is a fundamental tenet of perennialism, that all of the messengers came with one message, with the same message. All right? Now, that's the most central tenet. So right there, and you could have that, and you could just say, okay, that's my only part, and I'm a perennialist, and I believe that, all right? The problem that comes in is that then people start to think that perennialism means syncretism, which is that you could take from that tradition, you could take from that tradition, you could take from that tradition, and you can do your yoga exercises in the morning, go to Juma on Friday, and all these different things. And this is, I mean, if you've read perennialist writings, you know that the perennialists actually completely eschew that understanding. Now, Aldous Huxley and his perennial philosophy might not completely eschew that, and there are certain New Age movements that cite perennialist principles in their defense of doing things like this. But insofar as the perennialist philosophy can be identified as a particular school represented by the likes of René Guénon, Frithjof Schuon, Titus Burckhardt, Martin Lings, Sayyid Hussein Nasser, that is a principle that they completely eschew. That is the idea that one could actually mix from many parts of different traditions. Now, what really gets into it, and what I really think that you're talking about here, is the notion of soteriological pluralism. That is, that people can be saved from other traditions. Now, this is something that is has a very interesting history in our tradition. I mean, people are surprised if you go in and you actually find out that Ibn Taymiyyah is one of the ones who held that eventually everyone is taken out of hell. When he was criticized roundly by other people for going against what they considered to be the ijma', or the consensus of the tradition for that. Tajuddin Subki criticized him for this. Now, at the same time, there are others, in Al-Ghazali and his Faisal al-Tafrika, he probably goes the furthest in his position regarding the potential for people who are still living in other religious traditions to actually achieve salvation. And to kind of break it down in simplistic terms, we don't have a lot of time here, but we could actually do a whole lecture just on Al-Ghazali's theory on this, and Sherman Jackson would be the better person for that than me. But is that he's saying that so long as one has not heard the call of Islam, that one can actually, in a sense, still be saved. A Jew or a Christian living somewhere, and he mentions the Byzantine Empire, and often these other parts, that if they haven't heard the full call, they can still be saved. And one of the things that he says within that is that even at times, if one hears the distorted message, so for example, right now you hear about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Quran on Fox News, you're probably not going to become a Muslim. I mean, you got to have like some kind of amazing firasa. If when you hear about it on Fox News, you're like, yes, I mean, that's like, you got to be a prophet yourself if that's gonna break through, mashallah. So anyway, so this is one of the ideas that he has. Now, the point is that you bring in this, we could talk about Ibn Arabi's ideas regarding this, and Rashid Rida and others, and Shah Waliullah is somewhat close to Al-Ghazali in his understanding. But there are lots of different understandings of this within our tradition. The fact that there are all of these different understandings of it shows us the question's not settled. All right? It is a question that is open for discussion. There's not just one single perception of it. We have put within the study Quran ways in which that question could be contemplated in relation to particular verses, such as the famous verse 262 and 3199 and verses along these lines. We've addressed that in places. We haven't said that that's the way that one has to do it. In those places, we put the other options that you have within what one might call the mainline tafsir tradition. So I think that we have properly represented what the classical tradition says regarding this, and made it clear that there are other ways that this could potentially be approached. And it is a question that by the way, this is one of the things that we need to think about. Ismail Faruqi said that one of the things that really distinguishes Islam from other religions and distinguishes the Quran from other scriptures is that it commands those who follow this revelation to believe that other prophets and other religions came from God, and that they had revelations. This is an amazing feature of this religion. And it's something that we actually have. It's something we have to offer the modern world. We have something to offer the modern world in how do you address the problem of religious diversity in a way that doesn't make one particular religion have to reign supreme at all times over others, and allows for interaction between the different religions when it is our actions. Our actions are what you call, look, when it comes down to it in the Quran, basically the question of soteriological efficacy, what I think the Quran is telling us is that's above your pay grade. God's going to distinguish between them on the day of judgment regarding that wherein they differed. God's going to distinguish between you on the day of judgment regarding that wherein you differed. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. So compete with one another in good deeds. Or جَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Argue with them in the most beautiful manner. Don't go out there and say kufr. And stuff. That's not useful. All right? And it really isn't something. One of the things is people think that if you do this, somehow you're holding this guard and people are going to leave the religion of Islam. Do you know how many people, for every person that we celebrate coming in through the front door of the mosque to take Shahada, we're ignoring the other person who's leaving out the back door? And one of the reasons is because there are a lot of issues that we aren't answering in a way that is sufficient for our community. And this is a door that I think we shouldn't be afraid to open. We don't have to agree, but we can start to come to some answers that actually reply to the exigencies of the day in which we live.
Thank you. You think this is interesting? Well, it's about to get more interesting. I'd like to bring in the panel.
All right. Should I sit down for this part?
Yes, come sit down.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
All right.
If we could bring that microphone down for Ustaz Abdullah. Well, I'm really grateful to a couple of our faculty members who are able to join us tonight. Ustaz Ali Atai is the first Muslim graduate. He is the one closer to me. From the program in Biblical Hermeneutics from the Pacific School of Religion, the Graduate Theological Union, right across the street. With a love of languages and working knowledge or expertise in Latin, Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, and Persian, Ustad Ali teaches courses at Zaytuna in Arabic, the Quran, and comparative religion. And he's pursuing right now his doctoral work at the Graduate Theological Union. Ustaz Abdullah Ali graduated from the Qarawiyyin in Fes, Morocco, before joining the faculty of Zaytuna College. He has continued to pursue his doctoral work at the GTU and runs a dynamic scholarly website, Lamppost Productions. Check it out. Ustaz Abdullah teaches courses in law and prophetic tradition at Zaytuna. He's also an instructor in our Living Links program for honor students. And these classes are open to the public. They take place on Saturdays. And they'll begin this semester on January 29th. So you're welcome to come here and join them in person or in live stream. So let me turn it over to the faculty for questions and comments. We'll begin with Ustaz Abdullah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be here to share the stage with this distinguished cadre of scholars, and just to let those of you who may not know that I've actually known Professor Lumbard, Jospeh Lumbard, for some number of years. We first met back in Morocco, back when I was a student, actually. When I don't know exactly what year. I know it was probably either 98, 99, or
yeah, I think
somewhere around there.
Yeah, it was back there.
Yeah,
a long time ago.
Right, exactly. So, alhamdulillah, so it's really an honor to be here with him today. And I guess I would begin by saying, he's sort of, he's heated up the mic. And there's quite a bit, that is happening and going on in my mind at the moment. And of course, I did prepare some things to ask him. And I do have a few minutes, right?
Please, please.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, and Saad Ali, he brought his notepad. I brought my phone. Yeah. Before I move to my question, I did want to just offer a couple of caveats to issues related to, in particular, Imam Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah regarding to the issue of the salvation of people who follow other religions. First and foremost, the position of Ibn Taymiyyah realistically would pertain to the matter of whether or not, the question of whether or not the hellfire would come to an end. So in that sense, yes, he did believe that that the hellfire eventually would be done away with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would undo it, and the last person from humanity will eventually come out. Unfortunately, that particular position was never accepted by Islamic orthodoxy, and even the Salafis today, who actually would claim to be followers of Ibn Taymiyyah, they staunchly reject this position, even in the Aqidah of Tahawiyah and its commentary by Ibn Abil Izz, who has a gloss by Sheikh Nasruddin Albani. Albani mentions this position, which is also mentioned by Ibn Abil Izz, that he said that the Sunnis have two positions. One is that it will last forever, the other that it won't. But Albani says in his laws, and no one from the Salaf ever said this, that there's no precedent for anyone who's ever said this. And Imam Ghazali's position, I've actually mentioned this position before, but it's also been brought to my attention that Ibn Hajar Haytami has actually argued that the position of Imam Ghazali actually may be the result of someone meddling in one of his works, because in one of his later works he had a different opinion on that issue. At any rate, there's not really enough time to really get involved with that. But what I really wanted to begin was with, well, first and foremost, I'll say that I definitely agree that the study of Quran is a very impressive and remarkable work, an extremely important work for Islam in our times, and there's great benefit to be taken from it. And I would say that even though I can't fairly offer either even necessarily a sort of a categorical rejection of certain things, or even a categorical commendation of it, because I haven't really read through most of it yet. But I have read some parts of it I feel are relevant, at least for this particular issue. But that said, I would say that I wanted to begin with a question, I guess you would say, would be somewhat easy for you to answer, and then one perhaps a little bit more difficult. The first one pertains to the very fact that the very beginning of the study Quran, or say, well, the inside cover, there is a mention of the fact that this particular translation is one which is accurate, accessible, and also, let me get my glasses. I have my glasses on. Yeah, I'm put on my glasses. There's another word. I can't remember what the other word was. I dropped my glasses. Accurate and accessible. A New English translation of the Quran that is accurate, accessible, and reliable in how it renders this sacred text. There's a question I posed to Professor Ernst when he visited some years ago, related to his how to read the Quran. And that particular question was, if for all of Muslim history the scholars have held, as the Quran says itself, that the Quran is the Arabic text, if I'm reading the translation of the Quran, how can I be taught how to read the Quran? And related to that, with regard to the studied Quran, I'm just wondering if mention of this being an accurate translation is understood as being an exact rendering of the Arabic into the English language. And I was just wondering how you might sort of respond to that. And I could begin with my second question, but or maybe perhaps you wanted to begin?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, and that's marketing material. That's not. I mean, you know, ultimately, I myself would say. I mean, I agree that it's very difficult to fully render the Quran. There is certain, and you sit there when you're translating it, and you're like, yeah, only God could have done that. There's no way that I can render this accurately. And the more you sit there and you go into, you really realize kind of the miraculous nature of the language in the Quran, and it really is a daunting task. So I think that we did aspire to do something as accurate and as reliable as we could as human beings. One of the things that I often, when people ask me about translating the Quran, I say, you know, the idea that the Quran is, quote, untranslatable, end quote, as we often hear. I think that one could really, you know, there's an explanation in translation theory where they talk about it like energy conduit. Like, you know, when you send energy, one of the main things in energy is trying to keep as much energy as possible when it's going from one place to another, and you're always going to lose something. And it's in translation, it's the same thing. You're always going to lose something. And especially when you're translating from a Semitic language to an Indo-European language, there are just certain things you're going to lose. You can't do a jumla ismiya in English. Well, if that's what it is from one human discourse to another human discourse, then what are we talking about when we're going from divine discourse down into the human? There's even more that is lost along the way. And in a perfect world, everybody would just read Arabic, and alhamdulillah, we don't need a translation. But as we know, you know, only 15% of Muslims actually speak Arabic, and you know, I teach in the Arab world right now, and I can tell you that a lot of my Arabic students, you know, they don't really understand the Quran. You know, they can recite some of it, and this, but they don't actually understand many of the words. My next door neighbor's daughter, who's Syrian, is educated in an English-speaking high school, prefers to read the Quran in English when she wants to study it. But if she's going to recite it, you know, read it in Arabic. So, you know, this is a kind of a phenomenon that we have. And since there are, I would say, if there were not another English translation out there of the Quran, I wouldn't try to be the first. But given that you've already got 80 out there, it seems kind of superfluous to do another one. But that there are already that many out there, it doesn't, you know, it seems that trying to do one that can be a little bit more accurate. And even now, I was looking at places where I think that we could have captured the word order of the Arabic a little bit better, because I think word order is something that's of fundamental importance in the Quran. But I think that there are places where we could have actually captured that a little bit better. So no, it's not. We're trying to basically make, you know, it's not good marketing material to say as reliable as possible in human language. So,
well, it leads me to my second question, which I don't know, perhaps it may not be as challenging to you or not, but I sort of feel that perhaps it may be somewhat challenging for you, because it relates to the question of authority and how persuasive this book is expected to be, or potentially could be. And I personally have a desire for the study of the Quran to be authoritative, to be accepted by as many people as possible. And but I wonder if there are certain things that have been done, or certain decisions that have been made with regard to the publication of this book, or things that happened prior to it even, which may challenge or make it difficult for certain people to, and Muslims in particular. Now we know that, okay, we can say it was just an academic work, but we know that we have two communities generally. You know, we have the mainstream community, which is not an academic community. You know, our community is largely a devotional community. And then, of course, as an academic, I can look at this and say, oh yeah, I like this, I don't like that, you know, I disagree. And the sort of angst that a lot of people feel, and particularly the Sunnis that we were spoken about earlier, I think it has something to do with not so much that you or anyone else had played a part in the study Quran, but rather it was because the people in the Sunni community who they feel are supposed to represent the devotional crowd, I guess you would say, have not highlighted certain things to sort of look out for. So at any rate, so the issues I think that are challenged to that objectivity and authority, they relate to, first and foremost, the committee itself. And what I mean by that is, and this is something actually Dr. Nasser himself is not apologetic about. He doesn't try to hide it when you read his introduction. And he talks about how his selection had occurred with regard to who would form this committee. And one thing that is apparent from that committee is that he's talked about this unity that they have, this unity of, there's an intellectual unity amongst the committee, there's a philosophical unity, and a spiritual unity amongst those three of the members of this committee. But another thing the members of the committee share is that all of them are either, we could say, mentees of Dr. Nasser or students in one way, shape, or form, which itself kind of, I guess you can, when you look at it, they said perhaps it can challenge that objectivity. Another aspect of that, it would be just when you look at the qualifications listed of each of the editors, that we find, of course, that each of them, for instance, are what they share would be like a specialization in philosophy, specialization in Sufism, some of them perhaps as well Shi'ism, and some of them theology, like yourself, comparative theology. You find that, but I'm wondering if it would have been good to actually also include amongst those people, such as someone who's a specialist in Islamic law, someone who may be a specialist in usul, for instance, or a specialist in hadith, scholars, like that. Unless we're saying that philosophy itself is the meta discipline and it is sufficient for everything else, and of course for Shiites that might work, but for Sunnis historically it would be a challenge, because for Sunnis historically theology has been the meta discipline for Muslims, so if we don't have those things there, then it could become a challenge. And then lastly, I would say another thing that makes it which is a challenge of objectivity, has to do with the very fact that the three main general editors, two of them being American converts, and then a third one being from Canada, of course not a convert, but as mentioned, Circassian heritage. Why not someone from Europe? Why not someone from the Arab world? Why not someone from the Muslim world in general as well, you see? So those are some issues that I feel could be potentially damaging to the authority of the book, even without getting to the details. So I just wanted to just put that out there, just to get your thoughts on it.
Well, first of all, one thing I should say, there were several other people that we actually did try to get along the way to be editors in the project, and most people looked at the size of this project and just said, like, I've got a family, I got a life. And so we really did actually try in many ways to have a larger, more expansive and more representative committee. We actually tried that also with some of the essays. And that is something that, it's one of these things that by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you end up with what you end up with. And in some ways, I think that one of the things that might have happened here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew how difficult this task is going to be. There's a lot of stuff that we had some knocked down, dragged out, nights on Skype and stuff. And there was some stuff that we really, went over, and then, you had to go back to it the next night and try to say, look, I'm sorry, I was just, I'm just into this. Okay, so we'll forgive each other and move on, but I mean, you add a few more ingredients into that pot, and then that would get even more complicated. So I think that really it was a lot of the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that made some of these people have, and in some instances it was just life circumstances that didn't allow them to be involved even when they wanted to be involved. So these are, this is how it ended up. Now, one of the things that part of what you are leading into here is, or part of what is related to this, is the question of the authority of the text. I mean, I really don't, it's out there. It's going to assume whatever position it assumes, and I can't control that in any way, really. But what I think is important is that the study Quran should be viewed as the first. It should be viewed as the beginning. If you look at the history of study Bibles out there, many of them were done because people who were pious Christians within certain denominations were not at all happy with the perspectives that were out there in study Bibles. And so they wanted to do another one that had a more evangelical perspective, a more Catholic perspective, a more Orthodox perspective, and things along these lines. And so I think that others should be done. And if anybody wants to do another one, I'd be happy to tell them the pitfalls and the things to watch out for, and help them compose their goodbye letter to their wife for the next, 9 years, and then, go on your way. But it really is something that I think one of the things that you bring out is like, it would actually be really great to see the Sunni study Quran and be able to explain that. If you want to do the Sufi study Quran, count me in, But there should also be a Shiite study Quran. And I think that there should be multiple study Qurans out there. I think that it should be, I think it is a genre that opens up the discourse in a way that could be very useful for our communities. And it could be a way that we could see, because if you look at the history of tafsir, it takes on very different forms over time in different ways. And this could be a way in which I don't want to call this a tafsir, because a tafsir has a particular place within the tradition, and I do view it more as being kind of a study academic text. But I think that there's room for many more, and I personally welcome it, and I hope to see them.
Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sallallahu Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dr. Lumbard, thank you very much. We actually met 2 years ago. I used to drive a cab, and you came. No, I'm just joking. Maybe on Yom Alast.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
I don't know. Allahu Alam. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very enlightening. I have 2 questions for you. The first one is just sort of your opinion about something. Recently you described the tafsir of the study Quran section, the commentary, as being something like the heart of the project, in the sense that it's very ecumenical, bringing together traditional Sufi, Shiite, as you said, and Sunni tafsir. And that's a remarkable achievement and something that should be appreciated. I mean, this man gave 9 or 10 years of his life doing this project, so barakallahu feekum, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you for that and give it acceptance, inshallah ta'ala. So my question is, in Christian academic circles, they have, critical editions of the Greek New Testament, the United Bible Society, Nestle Allen, so on and so forth, where you have an eclectic text in Greek, basically taken from the most reliable manuscript witnesses. And then at the bottom of the page, you have this critical apparatus showing the variant readings of the Greek. So my question is, do you think there's merit in doing something like that? I know Arthur Jeffrey used to call for something like that, Carl Ernst, a critical Arabic edition of the Quran, where you have maybe the Hafs Qira'ah, the Rasm, or as you translated, the consonantal skeleton there, and then a critical apparatus showing the differences of the 7 readings, or 10, or several, whatever 7 means, the 1,000 or so differences there in the critical apparatus, but also maybe showing in that critical apparatus pre-Uthmanic codices or manuscripts like Ibn Mas'ud or Ubay ibn Ka'ab or the Yemeni palimpsest, or even the one that was just discovered in Birmingham, to sort of own the differences. Because this is something that's demanded by Western academia. There's no critical Arabic edition of the Quran. Why don't you do that? Own the differences, and then actually take some time and explain through sophisticated answers why we have these differences. Do they touch upon the integrity of the text at all? do they preclude the belief that the Quran is a divine revelation? What's your opinion about having an eclectic Arabic critical edition?
I don't think it would necessarily be eclectic. I think that actually, but I think it's a great idea, actually, and I think that, and as you know, there are multi-volume works in Arabic that collect not only the 10 qira'at, but also, the shaf qira'at, and those that are considered to be, there were 80 different qira'at or more before the kind of tradition went down, and in the 4th century, they said these 7 are mutawatir, these 3 are mashhur, and these are the ones that are acceptable for recitation in prayer.
Yeah.
This is actually a really interesting distinction, is that they say that these are acceptable for recitation in prayer, but sometimes in the tafsir tradition, you'll find them say, this reading is not acceptable for qira'ah, but it is acceptable, or for tilawa, but it is acceptable for tafsir. And so there was a much broader view than sometimes we imagine there may have been regarding these different readings. And I think you're absolutely right. I think not only own them and do that, but I think actually a translation that has the translation, and then it has the translation according to the different qira'at below it. I think that would be a fantastic contribution, and I do think that it's something that we should do. And there's a lot of these tools that exist within the field of biblical studies that sometimes we're afraid of, because we're afraid of of the way that some people in other disciplines want to use them as regards the Quran. But actually, some of them are if we were to reimagine them, and like you say, own it within our tradition, they're actually very useful. I mean, there's somebody who's doing his dissertation on the history of the Isnad at Harvard, and he's basically saying, this was actually a tradition borrowed from outside of the Islamic tradition and then used, and like now we say, like, if you don't have the Isnad, you don't have knowledge. And it's like, wow, we took that from outside and we used it. Like, we should not be scared of these tools. They offer interesting things for us. They offer fascinating things for us. Now, there's another point that you brought in, which is somewhat different towards the end of that, is does it in any way impugn the integrity of the text? And this is one of the things that I came to kind of realize through the process of doing this, is that it doesn't at all. That one of the things that actually preserves the integrity of the Quranic text, and I think that this is part of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that kind of polyvalence is built in even on the linguistic level. Why? Because just to have that approach, when you realize that the text is multi-layered and multivalent, even on the linguistic level, it's going to help you realize how it can be multi-layered and have multiple different meanings when you get into the interpretive level. The other thing is that it's almost like this instant linguistic reminder that human language cannot fully contain the divine word. And it's like the Quran is human language fractured by the divine presence. That's part of the incredible genius of this text, and there is nothing like it in the world. And we can own it, and we can show it to the world.
Thank you very much. Jazakallah khairan. My second question is a slightly different topic here, regarding the Quran's criticism of traditional Christianity. I don't think the issue is that the prophets did not bring the same message, or that all religions did not come from God, but do these religions and their traditional understandings teach the same things about God? Is there a theological critique in the Quran of Trinitarian Christianity? The reason I'm asking is because in the translation of the study Quran, Surah Ma'idah, I believe ayah number 72, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَةٍ. That it is a statement of those who have disbelieved, who say, this is not your translation, this latter part is, that God is one of three. God is one of three.
Or the third of three.
The third of three. God is the third of three. So my question is, here, you mentioned in the essay towards the back that the Quran does not oppose, this is a direct quote, the various forms of orthodox Trinitarian doctrines. It opposes crude misunderstandings of it. Essentially, what I gather from that is that this verse is condemning tritheism and not necessarily orthodox, I know you don't like that word, or traditional Trinitarian belief. And if that's true, then the traditional belief, Trinitarian belief, is that Jesus is homoousios, that he shares an essential essence with God. So is that not problematic from an Islamic standpoint? So basically, does the Quran, in your opinion, consider Orthodox Trinitarianism as constituting a type of shirk or not?
I think that this gets in, the Trinity is a very complicated issue, obviously. And I actually agree. I think that one of the things, people tend to criticize the Perennialist school and then not read them because they're told that they shouldn't read them, and then have no idea what they say. And you go and you look, for example, Frithjof Schuon has an excellent discussion of the Trinity. And he basically says, look, the Trinity was an unnecessary doctrine. It has a way of explaining God, but it is unnecessarily complicated. And I do think that that when one gets into what the Christian tradition is trying to explain with its understanding of the nature of Isa alayhi salam, is in many ways the same thing. A lot of people aren't going to like this, but it's in many ways the same thing that we are trying to explain with the doctrine of the Quran as the uncreated Word of God. Is that where is that line between the Word of God and this attribute? Now, it's not exactly, it's not a one-to-one correspondence, I know, between the traditions, but it is the same kind of overall metaphysical problem of where you draw that line between the absolute divine presence and the nature of the revelation, or we could call it the logos, to use a Christian terminology, or the kalimatullah, as Isa alayhi salam is referred to as a kalima min, a word from God. And ultimately, I think that if you look at how much debate there has been within Christianity itself regarding this issue, it's not something that you're ever going to have an agreement coming out. Remember that even the people even some of the Mu'tazilites who were criticizing those who later became the Ash'arites, one of the things that they said is, you're saying the same thing about the Quran that the Christians are saying about Jesus. That was one of their actual criticisms of the argument. Now, again, like I say, I don't think that there's a one-to-one correspondence between what's being said there, especially because there's not this idea of the homoousios. But I do think that there is a line, and I do think that one of the things that the Quran is opposing is the potential for very crude misunderstandings of Christian doctrine, and unfortunately, the history of debates regarding it has shown that there are a lot of crude misunderstandings. I think that and this is one point where I actually agree quite a bit with Frithjof Schuon, is that this is an esoteric doctrine that should not have been made, in a sense, to a full exoteric doctrine, because there's too much room for misunderstandings to arise regarding that. And when you read many of the verses, and you probably know all of the debates within Christian theology regarding the nature of Isa alayhi salam better than I do, when I read the verses of the Quran regarding these issues, I see it as taking positions within that ongoing debate regarding the nature of Isa within and beyond the Christian tradition.
Okay. Would you say the Quran is rejecting this idea that Jesus is God himself?
That Jesus is God himself, yes.
Okay. Follow-up question, last question. In that same ayah, Inna Allaha thalithu thalatha, could it be here that Allah here could be, because I'm thinking about John 17:3, where Jesus calls the Father Ton Manon Arethenon Theon, the only one who is truly God. I mean, he's the only one who is truly God. So in other words, the Quran here is criticizing the Trinity as it is understood traditionally by Christians, but not using the word Father, but using the word Allah, but sort of accepting that meaning of Ab as Rabb, as someone who takes care of you, someone who raises you in stages, someone who's personal, God's immanence. Could you read it like that as well? That, if you say God is one of three, that here God is essentially, the Father, without using that term. Therefore, the Quran is criticizing.
When you're saying that God, well, I think that, there's an issue here when you get into the Trinity. Remember that when you're talking about the three people, the three persons of the Trinity, there's a tendency to say that they are of one essence, and no one single one of them is prior to the other. However, the Father causes the Spirit and the Holy Spirit and the Son. And as one Christian theologian said to me, he said, well, a cause is necessarily prior to that which it causes. And so I think that even, within that aspect of Trinity, when you are viewing the Father as being the cause, and if you take that aspect of it, and this is where, I even think, Meister Eckhart referred to swing beyond the Trinity into the Godhead, and then, of course, as we know, he was criticized for that, and he later recanted the position, at least in an open discourse. And so, but I do think that as regards that position, again, this gets into these subtleties regarding the nature of the Trinity, that there is a way that one can understand it as indicating a principle that is beyond multiplicity.
Before you go to the audience, can I just add one thing?
Do one more, and then we'll go to the audience.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to just begin because I don't want to turn this into sort of necessarily a personal interrogation, because of course this project was a collective project on your part, but this issue does stick out, and it's a very passionate people, Muslim Sunnis in particular, who are critical of the Sunnis, of the study Quran, are very passionate about this particular issue, and it comes up a number of times throughout the study Quran by different authors, multiple authors. And so for me, it's more, my concern is more with the obligation, I feel, that you're sort of an academic or scholastic obligation that a person like yourself and others would have to at least highlight in your comments that while you may adopt a particular interpretation, that historically, this view which actually accommodates, or accommodates, or I guess you would say, offers salvation to people other than Muslims, people who themselves have been reached by Islam, and people themselves who understand the message and they still reject it, that this itself is something relatively new in Islamic history. And I just wanted to read this one quote this is from Professor Dudley on page 187. He's commenting on verse Surah 3, verse 1. No, it's not very long, but it just basically he goes on to say this: there may be a third possibility. The verse, and truly among the people of the book are those who believe in God and that which has been sent down unto you, and that which has been sent down unto them, humble before God, and not selling God's sign for a paltry price. It is they who shall have their reward with their Lord. Truly, God is swift in reckoning. So he goes on and says, there may be a third possibility, often left unexplored by Muslims until recently, that one can remain a Christian while affirming the veracity of the Prophet Muhammad and what was revealed to him. Right. So, for me, I just think that when those type of quotes are made in the book that is, just as often when other opinions that the editors disagree with, they would say, well, this particular opinion is not popular or is not backed up by a strong narration, that you would think that, that honesty would sort of dictate that, okay, well, this is an interpretation, but it doesn't represent historical Islam. You see,
I mean, he said often unexplored by the commentary tradition. I mean,
until recently.
Yeah, but the other thing is that within that context, I mean, it's interesting that the historical context of that particular verse is said to refer to the death of the Najas, the Christian leader of Abyssinia, and it's said that actually that it was in that context that the verse came down, and so there's some dispute actually within the classical tafsir tradition itself as to whether or not that was an affirmation that the Najas had actually affirmed Islam, but remained, whether or not the Prophet actually said that he prayed the funeral prayer for him, and that he did, the takbir for him, and that he was even accused. Some in his community were actually unhappy with that and confused by it at the time. So, and there's different opinions within the classical tradition, but that's, that fact that that's the asbab al-nuzul, or the sabab al-nuzul, is well attested. And so, if I were to have written the commentary on that, that's something that I would have brought out more, and related to it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying regarding that I would say that there are points within the text where maybe that consideration could be brought out. I mean, I was actually reading my essay regarding sacred history, and I realized that the question of the abrogation of other religions is something that I felt like I didn't deal with sufficiently. Part of it we had, even that essay went over the word limit, but still, I feel like that I kind of ran over that dimension of it a little bit, more than I should. And I should have represented what some of the classical debates are regarding the abrogation of other religions, rather than just kind of running through it and saying, well, there's another way to look at it.
Right.
Well, we've covered quite a bit of ground, and I think there are some interesting things that are just lurking. Even a question like, there being word limits and marketing exigencies. What does that do to the nature of a work? But we've talked about, the intricacies of the Trinity, the possibility of a critical Arabic edition of the Quran, or at least one with a critical apparatus. Translation as an energy conduit where there's loss that takes place. We use that word that I won't repeat. We talked about the difference between traditionalism and tradition. And also I thought I heard earlier on something like an intellectual battle for the soul of the study of Islam in the academy that's being waged here. So some very interesting material and food for thought. Before we conclude, we're about an hour and 40 minutes in, but we should give probably about 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the audience before we wrap up, perhaps by around 9:30, and then there'll be an opportunity to purchase books and have a book signing with one of the editors. So, are there any questions? What I would like you to do is line up here, and from that side, so you're not standing in the middle, and please keep it to a brief question and respect the right of others to ask after you, and I'd also like as brief and direct response as possible so we can get as many as we can in. Dr. Jennifer Bryson is in the front.
So my question is primarily for you, Mahan, although there may be other responses, and I felt that Joseph in many ways responded to his perspective on my question during his remarks. During your introduction, you drew a very stark dichotomy between Western academy and the Islamic tradition.
Yes.
And you didn't say classical tradition. It was not a time frame, but the Islamic tradition.
Yes, you saw that.
And I'm curious as to why and whether or not there's room, if this is a living intellectual and spiritual and devotional tradition, for these roots to grow branches in other places, and where do believing Muslims who happen to be in Western institutions and who cherish and draw from the tradition, where do they fit in? And this relates to, what is the study Quran?
Sure, that's a very nice question. And, I was conscious of it when I was doing it, in part because it's most helpful to frame something in as stark of attention as possible on its endpoints, and then to unravel that, because it's a very problematic dichotomy. And I'm very happy that some of the comments rolled that back in. And if they hadn't, I would have maybe pushed a little bit further, because what do you do with the Muslim academics who are studying their sources but may not have traditional training or traditional licenses, but nonetheless have access to those very sources and are reading them and arguing and using the same tools of reasoning that we all share in common? So that is a tension that I deliberately set up so that we could perhaps question it. Thank you.
My wife and I were reading Surah Maryam from the Study Quran. So Dr. Lumbard, there was one verse we never heard this before. It was the surah about, or the ayah about Sayyidatna Maryam eating dates from the palm tree. And considering that Christmas for Orthodox and Protestant Jews is around the winter time, a lot of Muslims would say, oh, since she ate dates from the palm tree, then Sayyidina Isa's birth was around the summer, because that's when dates are ripe. But the Study Quran in the commentary explains, well, the evidence that she ate dates in the winter is actually a miracle from God. That's the first time I heard that, so I was wondering where the origin of that came from.
I actually can't say, because I didn't write the commentary on that.
Okay,
one of the things about the Study Quran is that, so as an editor, I was an editor for the commentary on Surahs 2 through 28, and I wrote the commentary and wrote and researched the commentary for Surahs 29 through 114 and for the first Surah. As well. So unfortunately, sometimes when it gets into some of those issues, I actually, some of them I'm really glad that some of my colleagues had to deal with some of the more contested verses, and I didn't have to. But at the same time, it does mean that I would have to ask Maria Daycake about that one in particular. So my apologies.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the great presentation and wonderful discussion. Afterwards, I wanted to know what method you used when deciding which commentaries to cite from on which verses, because you used, I think, like over 40 different tafsir. How did you decide which tafsir to draw on for which verse? And then just very quickly, secondly, I wanted to ask about the issue of polyvalence, so things having multiple meanings, or the Quran having different readings, because that's something that seems to be much more challenging for Muslims or just people of faith in general today than when we look at the classical tradition. When you have Tabari just lists all these kind of opinions without even discriminating and saying this is the one I think is right or not. If you could maybe, why is that the case? Why do we seem to have more trouble seeing that different people say different things about things today? Thank you.
All right. That's two questions, I guess. So the first question, the methodology for using it. I think that all of the different authors of the commentary had a slightly different methodology. There's different tafsir that we might have preferred. And for most of us, one of the main things that we did, and we pretty much agreed that you would go through some of what you would call the ummahat tafsir, and these being the principal commentaries such as Tabari, Ibn Kathir. Well, Ibn Kathir actually historically wasn't always, but Tabari, Qurtubi, and Jalalain, and things like this, and look at some of these kind of fundamental tafsir that have had a certain, you might say, staying power within the tradition. And oftentimes, like I think the citation that you'll see more often than any other one is QRT, meaning this opinion is in Qurtubi, Razi, and Tabari. And so oftentimes for a lot of verses, that really is sufficient. It's like, if you go to those three tafsir, you're going to get a lot already. I mean, oftentimes with Tabari, you need a flow chart for just about anything. So, sorry, not Tabari, Razi, you need a flow chart. And so that would be that. But then sometimes, like if it was a particular legal issue, there are other tafsir that you would want to go to. The Qurtubi is much stronger on a legal issue than Razi or Tabari, obviously, and often Qadi Abu Bakr bin Iyad, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi is an excellent source for legal issues. And then there were even other sources, outside of that, sources on ahkam and Quran that are not sometimes considered to be tafsir necessarily, that we would look at if it was a legal issue. And sometimes, honestly, there are some verses that you would just go through and through and through and be like, man, nobody, like, what's going on here? Like, nobody seems to be getting this verse. And you go through and, like, literally you'd be on your 40th tafsir and you'd be like, oh, okay, finally. There are just some verses that it's like, and really this is part of how you see, it's like people want to say tradition, tradition. And it almost became a thing where people are following each other along, and it's like not writing about this verse. So why does everybody keep not saying anything about this verse? And then you finally get through and you find somebody who opens up an extensive commentary on it. And sometimes that's just happenstance. And other times, these were human beings. And had a bad week, had a bad month, but the tafsir had to get done. All right, and so, you go through and you find that, and you're like, this is, sorry, man, so-and-so's just not hitting on all cylinders on this one. And, you go to another one, and then at the same time, the inverse of that is that sometimes you open it up and you go, whoa, this man had an inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it comes to this particular surah or this particular ayah. And you just say, wow. And it really just hit him, and so you just and you just go with that tafsir in some instances. And a lot of times, as you're doing this for year after year after year, it's like, and you don't even know why you know. Like, that's something a Tha'labi's going to be into. And you don't even know how you know it, but like Tha'labi, that's his type of issue. And so you end up, it kind of becomes somewhat intuitive after times. Now, when it comes to some of those issues, those verses, I'll go for myself, a baseline that I had was to look at the qira'at, the multiple different readings, and employ them when they had an impact on the meaning. And of the 1,000 variations that you have, most of them don't actually have much impact on the meaning. Employ them when they had an impact on the meaning. And then also to look at the historical context, so the Asbab al-Nuzul, and again employ them when they seemed to be somewhat, because a lot of the Asbab al-Nuzul actually aren't very reliable. And even Tabari will say this, like Tabari will give you here are 5 Asbab al-Nuzul, but all 5 of them contradict the meaning of the verse, and they're mutually contradictory. And so you go through and you just, and so we would use them sparingly. But it's actually one of the baseline things that I did was actually to list them all out, and then actually trim them out over time and use those ones that actually help illuminate the verse in some useful way. But then also there's also Sufi tafsir, because when it comes to certain verses about that pertain to tarbiyah, the training of the soul, and also certain ideas such as that every soul knows and it can't, even if it makes an excuse, you just can't escape. It's like, you know it ultimately deep down. Like, you know, and this, by the way, and so this kind of expands, but I would say one of the things, it's like people have asked me, what would you say is one of the things that you learned through the course of this project? And one of the things I learned from the course of this project is that, you know, you often say the Quran is about there is no God but God, this, that, and the other thing. Ultimately, what the Quran, I think, is really about is like, you know the truth. You know the truth. And as much as you try, and deep inside, no matter what excuse you proffer, you're going to confront that. You're going to do it now, and this is how you do it. And the Quran helps you, and it gives you ways to do it. Or you do it when you die, and that's going to suck. You know, if you don't try to take care of it now. But it is. It's like, and if you really think about it, I mean, there's so many things, so many little ways that we all lie to ourselves about so many different things in our lives, and so many little things that we do to try to escape some of those little lies that we're telling ourselves on both as regards major issues and as regards minor issues. You know, like procrastinating or something along these lines. And ultimately, the Quran is trying to tell you, you know, all of that's in you, and you know it, and you need to bring it out. So, sorry, that was kind of a digression from answering your question.
Maybe he can do your second question offline, and we'll take the next one.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, so since this is not literalist tafsir, do you think the political implication would be the possibility of aspiring a new political philosophy out of the Quran that is more anarchist, and by anarchist I'm more social liberal, due to the very nature of the absolutist yet diverse perennial outlook? And is this anarchism a new hope for uniting Sunni and Shia thought?
Wow. You know, power to the people. You know, man.
Next.
Yeah, all right, I'm out of here. No,
go ahead.
I really, honestly, I don't know how to answer that question. I actually think that we've gotten into trouble with ways in which people have tried to read some political philosophies into or out of the Quran at the same time. And whether or not it could be more anarchist. I do think that one of the things is that the Quran does acknowledge that human collectivities are ultimately going to need some kind of order, and that without that order, there will be major complications, and it gives some of the principles for establishing that, and I think that hadith do as well. So, an ultimately anarchist way, and something that could unite Sunnis and Shiites. You might have some other ideas here that you've come up with, but I've never thought of the question, and I've never seen it in any way. That's a very interesting question.
Imam Zaid.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I'd like to thank you gentlemen for a very stimulating presentation, exchange. And I encourage the audience to give them another rousing hand. My question is, Joseph, from the way you responded to Ali's question concerning the Trinity, and I might have heard this wrong, it seems like you're implying there's a Trinitarian tradition in Christianity. It has its more sophisticated and nuanced understandings that ultimately lead to a Unitarian position, and it has its crude manifestations. My question, and that the Quran is responding within that context when those who say that Jesus is the third of three have rejected faith. Could it be possible that the Quran is defending a Unitarian position that is in opposition to Trinitarian doctrine and all of its manifestations, and that Unitarian position was the position that was taken by those who were arguing against the Trinity at the early church synods and councils that were set up to affirm church doctrine on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's definitely a possibility to read it that way. But I do think that when it comes down to it, ultimately, I mean, remember that even a lot of the things, Robert Festicky has written an article that deals with the issue, bringing out that when you go into the intricacies of Trinitarian theology and particularly in the Catholic Church, that it is trying very hard to take into consideration many of the considerations that we have in theology as Muslims. And it really is trying to look very hard at how to maintain. I mean, this is the Catholic Catechism, the Orthodox Catechism, that we believe in the one God. And they understand that for them, God is one, all right? Yes, God is one, and God is three in the Trinity at the same time, and you get into the ultimate details of that. Exactly where it all falls historically in the context of the Quran, I think, is something that we'll never fully know. But I do think that in terms of what it says, I mean, for example, when it says that the Virgin Mary is the part of the Trinity, in Surah Maryam, when it talks about that and making that the Trinity, I mean, this is not the Trinity as understood by the Catholics. You know, one of the things that Sheikh Hamza has brought out at times is that when you are talking to an atheist, and they say, you know, I don't believe in God. And they say, well, what do you think God is? And then they tell you, say, well, I don't believe in that God either. And so a lot of times when you were to say to Catholics, say, you know, we don't believe in the Trinity, if you were to go to most Muslims and they were to say, okay, well, what do you think the Trinity is? A Catholic who knows Trinitarian doctrine would say, I don't believe in that either. And so I do think that I think that when it comes to the question of the Trinity, I mean, there's been so much ink spilled within this, and it is a far more complicated doctrine than pretty much anything you have in basic Islamic creed, that it is something that there's always going to be a question. But yes, I am suggesting, A, that there is a way that it could be read as being, referring to misunderstandings and corruptions of that, but I also think that the possibility that you raise is definitely one as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Next.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a question and an idea. So, like, one of the ideas that I was just inspired.
Move closer to the mic.
So you were talking about how people have different ideas and they argue because of it. So and then you said, like, most of the times they both may be right. So, like, this just made me think about the verses of the Quran having different explanations, and so it's like so I just think that that's really motivating to think that when we read the Quran, we don't always have to think am I right about something, but it's more like this is the experience that my heart had on it, the reflection, you know, like, because everyone is different. So I just and my question is just like basically, what do you think about the Quran, different meanings, and how maybe since it's sent from Allah, everyone is a creation, so everyone has an independent reaction with this. So it's basically like that. Those are my feelings. But I just was very interested in this topic.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because also it gets back to Uludamane's question that about the polyvalence of the Quran that we didn't answer before.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
We'll make this the last question. So if you can also wrap up your concluding thoughts. And if you have anything, I don't see anyone.
Ahmed's back there.
Oh, I see there's someone else back there. Yeah. It's blocked. Okay, one more. So you will be the last.
All right.
And then when he comes, I'll ask for your concluding thoughts.
All right. So yeah, I think that is, but that one does have to make the distinction within this regarding this last question. That yes, every verse I think is addressed to the individual hearing or reading that verse at that particular time. And that things can come from that, and that it's an intimate conversation between the individual and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's addressed directly to the heart. Now, however, the issues that might come to mind from that are not ones that are necessarily that then apply outside of that to others. And so, whatever inspiration you have, it doesn't mean it's always necessarily right. But this is, there's a very technical science within the classical Islamic tradition of knowing, what you could call the places from which inspirations arise. And that is a very technical science, that are the al-waridat al-qalbiyya. Where did they actually come from? And actually one time I asked a Sufi sheikh, I said, because he said, particular people, when they're made Sufi sheikhs by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he gives them a particular gift. I asked him, what's the gift he gave you? And he said, I know where people's speech is coming from when they speak. Like, you could see what aspect of their being. Was it from their shahwat? Was it from their desires? Was it from the purity of heart, purity of intention, and things like this? And because we don't always know those waridat al-qalbiyya, and we don't always know that, then sometimes that's one of the reasons why we can't say that this might be a more universal understanding. And it's one of the reasons why, in a sense, we have the tafsir tradition to kind of, you might say, channel some interpretations. But there is definitely, I think, first and foremost, is an intimate conversation between the individual and God. And this gets into the polyvalence of the text, which is that really, even on the linguistic level, you've got these multiple different ways in which the Quran is recited. And then you have the possibilities that just arise from the grammar. Okay, you read it this way, you read it this way. You read that as a maf'ul bihi or a hal. And all of a sudden, bam, you've got a different meaning out of the verse. And so it's on that level, just linguistically you've got it. But then, the way that this is going to come out, and one of the things that we tend to not take account of is that over time in our different historical circumstances, just as today there are going to be issues regarding our historical circumstances that are going to condition how we read and interpret some of these verses, so too, in the past, there were different historical circumstances that conditioned the ways in which classical authors read and what they wrote within their tafsir at different times. If there was, Ibn Barajan, at his time, the Ismailis were a big problem. And so he actually wants to write a whole idea of how one can understand the Quran that excludes the possibility of Ismaili readings. And his readings are very much, his entire approach is actually very much conditioned by that. And it doesn't mean that what he's saying is wrong, but it means that at that historical period, these are some of the readings that one could come out with to answer those exigencies of the time. And they're going to come out in different ways at different times, and that is part of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves the text. If it wasn't something that actually ended up having a different manifestation, you might say, within humanity and helping answer our questions in different ways, then it wouldn't be preserved. And it wouldn't be something that we could apply to the human condition in all times.
Thank you.
Jazakumullahu alf khair. Quickly, actually the most transient question that kind of stuck out to me inside the discussion was talking about the study Quran not being devotional by design, and study Bibles are largely devotional across all denominations. So I guess my question is, could there be an iteration of the study Bible that would be more devotional in nature, or do you think that the very nature of the Quran as a recited scripture lends itself for study Qurans to not be devotional, or was the way that this one was particularly designed as this seesaw between different sects and academia and Eastern tradition lent itself to be less devotional and more academic? So, jazakumullah khair.
No, first of all, I want to clarify one of the things I said is that it's not something that one should necessarily view, but one could actually have. And actually somebody else told me that they were finding it very helpful in their particular recitations in their daily awrad that they were doing. These people also told me that they took it with them on their honeymoon. So they're unique individuals. So you know, it can. I don't recommend that, by the way. But anyways, so it really is something that can help you in that I think it could help. And people have told me that. I mean, other people have told me that they actually never really, like, this has, you know, kind of reawakened their relationship with the Quran. And alhamdulillah, I really feel, you know, blessed to have had an ounce of anything. I mean, it's really all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know. Yahdi lahu man yasha. That's not me, that's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's an honor to have been involved in some way. And you know, so I think that now, when it comes to what you're saying about some of the study Bibles, yes, like the evangelical, the Catholic, the Orthodox, yes, they are. But the Oxford Annotated isn't really, the HarperCollins Study Bible isn't. These, and it actually began as a non-devotional and non-denominational endeavor. And I think that that's one of the things that, you know, I think for the first one, to a degree, it was best that it not be within. And I've thought about this for a while. Why did this end up on our laps? You know, it's kind of weird. You get this question about how we ended up with this team. I think that actually the fact that none of us had particular commitments to the manner in which the study of the Quran was expressed within any particular schools was to some degree providential, because it made it something that we really could, in a sense, do something that might have the possibility of establishing a new paradigm in some way for how text can be done regarding within the Western context, and that inshallah other things will come that will be more devotional, that will be a Sunni study Quran, Ashur, a Maturidi study Quran. I hope that those come out. I hope that those are written, and they don't have to necessarily be done in English. But thank you. That's a good question.
Thank you. Would you like to have any concluding thoughts?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for coming. It was very enlightening. I learned a lot myself. I just want to conclude by saying, you know, the Quran says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Do they not have deep thought, penetrating insight into the Quran? And I think this is something that the study Quran has achieved, bringing together these tafsir. I actually find it very devotional myself, reading the tafsir. Maybe I'm just strange, but I enjoy reading tafsir. I find it, I feel my spirituality increase, if you will. So it's a very interesting text. I think what we can take away from tonight, I think the areas of contention were soteriology, plurality of religions. You know, does the Quran condemn the Trinity? Is the Trinity referenced at the end of Al-Ma'idah? I think those are the issues that I would like to expand upon more, and I encourage others to look into those issues as well. But thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank you as well for coming here, and this has been very, very, I think, very useful, very beneficial conversation here, and I think the audience definitely would admit that, you know, there's a lot that's been learned here. I think it's important for the Muslim community to try their best to, I guess you would say, make a distinction between, I guess you would say, one, a work which is largely produced as an academic project, even though it may contain devotional aspects to it. You know, and similar to Ustad Ali, when I read tafsir and things like that, if anything, like of all the books I ever read, I actually enjoy tafsir more than anything else, and actually feel like it does something to increase my faith by just learning more. By going through it, you know, be it something I agree with or don't agree with, just to be engaging with the Quran it does something to the soul. And so this is definitely a particular project. I can understand Dr. Nasser's sort of ambivalence about it. It is really a major undertaking to try to translate the Word of God. And of course, many other people have attempted to do so as well. That there's no way to perfectly convey the words of God from one language to another, and even, as you pointed out, even in the Arabic language is sort of like the Creator breaking through. It's in human language, but the Creator breaks through or shatters through it, and reveals Himself through the language. And I do think that is important for that. And so there's a tendency for people who are very religious, I guess you would say, quote unquote, very religious or less academic, I guess you would say, and very committed to some type of orientation or ideology, to find a way to discover the parts that are more offensive than the other parts that can be very useful. So I would say that definitely the study of Quran, there are more useful things about it than things that may be not so useful to certain people. So I definitely applaud the effort, and thank you for coming and giving us this opportunity to interrogate you.
Thank
so,
you.
Inshallah, hopefully you have a safe trip back home. Inshallah.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone. I had some things I wanted to say towards the end, but in the interest of time, I'm going to put those aside and really just pick on one aspect, I think, of what we've talked about today that's really stuck with me. And I think what's been helpful to understand and really appreciate is maybe we shouldn't think of this as the study Quran. When it's put forward as the study Quran, and the impression that people might receive is, well, all the other scholarship on the Quran has now been superseded, and this is the one that should be taken as the chief reference. And that's certainly not at all what's intended at all. The study Quran is part of a genre of study material, and it fits itself within that category. And I think the way that the editors and the scholars have approached it would, in the broad sense of the term, also place it within our tradition. And the tradition has always been contentious, it's vast, and as such, this is, inshallah, the first of many. This is a study Quran. And
But that's not a very good title.
That's not a very good title for marketing. Yes. For anyone who thinks that everything about the Quran that has needed to be said has been said in the past, they should take heed of the saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "La tanqadi ajaibuhu." It's a longer hadith on the authority of Ali radiallahu anhu, that its wonders will never cease, and وَلَا يَشْبَعُ مِنْهُ الْعُلَمَاء, and the scholars will never be satiated from its study. So please join me in thanking our panel. We'd like to thank also East Wind Books. They're outside, and copies of the study Quran are available. Dr. Joseph has kindly agreed to sign books, so you can make your way out there. And without any further ado, Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim, wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat, wa tawasaw bil haqq, wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.